And now, Great Moments in Manufacturing War, Part 6, The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, How America Manufactures War. It's me, and this is Part 6 of my series on how America manufactures war. Previous episodes have covered how the US manufactured wars against Native Americans, the Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, the Serbs in the former Yugoslavia, and the Muslims in Bosnia. We examine how US intelligence agencies manufacture consent for war by feeding lies to the media, which then amplifies them into public policy. If you haven't already seen them, please go back and watch those episodes before this one. Today we'll look at how the CIA helped manufacture the Vietnam War, an episode that has many similarities to what we've seen in other conflicts. Our story begins in August 1964, when the US destroyer Maddox was patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin near the coast of North Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin is a narrow body of water between North Vietnam and the southern half of the country, which was then called South Vietnam. At the time, US warships were there to protect South Vietnam from attack by North Vietnam and its allies, the Viet Cong. Both North and South Vietnam were communist countries, but they had split in 1954 after the First Indochina War, which pitted the indigenous Vietnamese against the French colonial rulers. That conflict ended with the Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided the country along the 17th parallel, with the understanding that elections would be held in 1956 to reunify the country, but those elections never took place. Instead, Ngo Dinh Diem, the US-backed dictator of South Vietnam, refused to allow them to take place. Hanoi refused to release the last batch of prisoners of war unless the elections were cancelled. So the situation remained frozen. The US supported South Vietnam because it wanted to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. It had already lost China and Korea to the communists, and feared that if Vietnam went the same way, so would the rest of Southeast Asia, including the British colony of Singapore, which was home to important American military bases. The US sent military advisors to South Vietnam in 1959, and economic aid began pouring in. By 1963, there were 16,000 US military personnel in the country, but the US involvement was supposed to be a secret. Congress had passed the Southeast Asia in 1961, prohibiting American military involvement in the conflict, although President John F. Kennedy ignored it and pushed ahead with arming and training the South Vietnamese army anyway. In May 1963, riots broke out in South Vietnam. Buddhist monks were protesting Diem's policies, which they saw as Diem responded by having his secret police beat and murder the This caused more anger and further protests until June, when Diem was forced to flee and was murdered 2 days later in a coup led by some of his own generals. The US didn't like this turn of events. While Diem was an oppressive ruler, he was also a staunch anti-communist. His death threatened to turn the country over to the communists, and possibly all of Southeast Asia. So the US government decided it needed to get involved to prevent that from happening. The Johnson administration came up with a plan called Operation Rolling Thunder, which involved bombing North Vietnam. On August 2, 1964, it began a sustained aerial campaign against the North, with the stated goal of breaking the will of the North Vietnamese people. 3 days earlier, however, on July, something else happened that would eventually lead to America's full-scale invasion of Vietnam. That was the day the USS Maddox was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. There are 3 versions of what happened that day. The first version comes from the US Navy. It said the Maddox and another US ship, the Turner Joy, were sailing through the Gulf of Tonkin when they were attacked by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The Americans fired warning shots, then attacked the Vietnamese ships, killing at least 17 of them. The second version comes from the North Vietnamese. It says 2 American destroyers were in an area patrolled by the North Vietnamese Navy. They were warned to leave, but they refused, so the North Vietnamese opened fire. The third version comes from the official American inquiry into the matter, which essentially corroborated the North Vietnamese account. Only 2 of the 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats had actually attacked the destroyers, and it wasn't an unprovoked attack. It was retaliation for a series of earlier attacks by the U.S. Navy against North Vietnamese vessels. In fact, it was a response to an attack only 2 hours before the Maddox incident, where the U.S. Navy had bombed and damaged a North Vietnamese transport ship. But despite the evidence that the Maddox incident was actually 2 separate engagements in an ongoing low-level conflict, the Johnson administration spun it as one massive, unprovoked attack. The official inquiries were ignored, and 2 days later, on August 4, 1964, the administration went to Congress asking for permission to defend the Maddox and Turner Joy against further attacks. It also asked for $300 million to strengthen South Vietnam's defenses, which Congress approved. Just one problem, though. The Maddox and Turner Joy hadn't been attacked on August 4th. In fact, no attacks had taken place since July 2nd. The entire incident was a fabrication. The day after getting the $300 million from Congress, the White House released this statement. It said on August 2nd and 4th, U.S. ships were again attacked by a large North Vietnamese naval force in the Gulf of Tonkin. Because these attacks were unprovoked and a threat to international peace and security, I have directed the continued use of air power as appropriate in the defense of our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now you can see the problem here, right? The administration told Congress it had repelled an attack on August 4th, when in fact there had been no attack. The point was to get congressional approval for bombing North Vietnam, which they did. 4 days later, the Air Force began bombing North Vietnam's airfields and military bases. This was a small-scale version of the upcoming blitzes that would devastate the country. The bombing campaign lasted for 7 years and involved 500,000 sorties, dropping over 750,000 tons of bombs, killed or wounded, perhaps 250,000 Vietnamese civilians. Operation Rolling Thunder was officially supposed to stop once the Gulf of Tonkin incident was avenged, but it didn't. The North Vietnamese kept attacking shipping in the Gulf of Tonkin, so the bombing continued. In reality, the Maddox incident was just a small-scale conflict that might have been forgotten by the American public. But President Lyndon B. Johnson seized upon it to expand America's role in Vietnam. He knew that Americans wouldn't support sending combat troops to fight in a distant jungle war, especially after the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba the previous year, so he escalated the war without telling anyone, slowly building up the number of troops in Vietnam, claiming each new increment was necessary to protect the latest influx of refugees fleeing the war Johnson created. This was possible because of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave the president authority to repel any future attacks against American ships. In reality, most of the refugees weren't fleeing war. They were fleeing South Vietnam's brutal dictatorship. The resolution turned out to be a blank check. The president could use it to send as many troops as he wanted to fight in whatever way he wanted. He claimed it was a defensive war, but it wasn't. The U.S. was fighting on both sides of the border to destroy North Vietnam's infrastructure. By 1967, 500,000 American troops were in the country, fighting alongside 300,000 South Vietnamese soldiers against perhaps 250,000 North Vietnamese regulars and 50,000 Viet Cong. Johnson didn't tell anyone what he was doing. In fact, the Pentagon Papers revealed years later that he had repeatedly lied to the American public about the nature of the war. He told the people it was being fought to contain the spread of communism, when in reality, it was being fought to prevent the loss of face for the United States. This is why the Vietnam War is considered by many to be America's first real defeat in war. It was a war of choice based on a lie, which makes it very similar to America's other wars of choice based on lies, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. So what can we learn from the history of the Vietnam War? For one, that wars are always sold to the public under false pretenses. Those who profit from war, including weapons manufacturers, oil companies, and intelligence agencies, have a vested interest in keeping the public in the dark. For two, that those in power feel no obligation to tell the truth. In fact, they have every incentive not to. And three, that the media plays an important role in manufacturing consent for war by amplifying the lies of those in power. If you want to know more about how this happens, I recommend you read Noam Chomsky's book, Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Society. And if you want to know more about the dangers of unfettered executive power, I recommend you read Chomsky's other book, Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies. I'm the host. This is part 6 of a series on how America manufactures war. If you haven't already seen them, please go back and watch parts 1 through 5.